So Professor Mike Bradshaw, one of our co-directors. We're also joined this morning by Ahmed Galani. Is that the right pronunciation, Ahmed? He's a research fellow at Leeds. He works on industrial decarbonisation. He's also the chair of our Early Career Researcher Committee, which we're very grateful for. And that's fantastic, very important to us that we do that career development sides of things. We've got Caroline Kazemko, also from Warwick, but from politics. She's a reader in the Department of Politics, not in the business school, like Mike. We're then joined by some respondents and panelists and co-authors. So we've got Keith McLean, as an independent consultant, ex-SSE policy guru, and for many years, the chair of our advisory boards, sadly standing down from that role. We're very grateful for the time he's put in. Dara Vyas, who is Deputy CEO, I think, now at Energy UK. And Raggy Lowe, who's joining us from the Scottish Government. We've also got Professor Keith Bell from Strathclyde, who is one of the co-authors writing with Mike about resilience and such things, who's joining us for the panel. Unfortunately, not all of the authors of the various different pieces that we've got in the review were able to join us. So I'm going to say a few words about energy efficiency and affordability, which is one of the sections that the review covers. And we also had an item which I'd really encourage you to have a look at, to do with the transport side of things. So I'm not going to try and speak to that just in the interests of time, but oil and gas prices have been doing slightly different things. That obviously oil prices went up this year as well, but not as much, not as dramatically. And so there's some interesting analysis in there about the relative cost of ownership of electric vehicles and conventional vehicles, given what we've been seeing with power price increases, which I think is one to watch over the coming months. It's been, I hardly need to say that it's been a tumultuous year. I mean, that in almost every imaginable, conceivable aspect of public life, but particularly in the energy space, we've seen what were very high but falling prices that then went back to very high prices again. We've seen an intervention on an unprecedented scale to protect households and some businesses from the very high prices that they would otherwise be experiencing, particularly if you think about the cost of keeping warm as we run through the cold snap that we're currently experiencing, when I think many people held off or minimized the amount that they were running their heating, but that's really not, you can't be comfortable. In fact, you'd be profoundly cold if you were trying to do that in most houses during the current period. UKIRC has made a number of contributions to this conversation through our work on gas availability and gas infrastructure, which I'm sure Mike will speak to, through our ongoing contribution to longer-term decarbonisation issues, which Ahmed will touch on in the industrial in industry context, and I think Keith will come back to for renewables and resilience. We also put a proposition forward in the spring of this year that we should be considering how we remunerate existing renewables and nuclear that are not under a CFD or contract for difference. And that idea, I think, was, we were very much in the lead with an idea of how to one means by which you might break the link between gas and electricity prices for at least some categories of generation, which I think is still on the cards for next winter, although it's been enabled by the energy bill, but it wasn't feasible to take it forward this year. And in any case, the current Chancellor preferred a windfall tax, which obviously helps a bit with public finances. On the energy efficiency side of things, and just very, very briefly, I really would encourage people coming along this morning to have a look at what we've got to say about energy affordability, written by our colleague Jan Webb at the University of Edinburgh. We do now have action from the government to put in place an information campaign and to take action on energy conservation and demand. And we're very keen to be a critical friend of government and to work constructively and positively with policymakers. But I think, and there's no point carping after the fact, but I do think it's really impossible not to mention the fact that there's a huge wasted opportunity right throughout the course of the summer to start helping households prepared for this winter, to think about the most straightforward energy efficiency measures that could have been put in place, thoroughgoing retrofit of our building stock to improve its thermal efficiency and performance, and retrofit boilers and so on is obviously a multi-year endeavour, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have made a start. And quite frankly, the conversation around not providing information to households because that's the nanny state can only be described as profoundly unhelpful. There's huge amounts of research evidence that suggests that information campaigns are useful and valuable and help households to make informed choices. In fact, if people didn't need information, why would we have an advertising industry? I won't say very much more because I'm very keen to keep all of my panelists to time. We've only given the presenters 5 minutes or so, and so I'm going to hold myself to time and stop there. We've just changed the running order, which is going to confuse me, but I think we are running Mike and then Ahmed and then Caroline. Am I correct about that? Does anyone remember? Yeah, okay. So some of them have slides, some of them don't. And over to you, Mike. Thanks very much.
Good morning, everyone. I don't have slides. Just thinking just how quickly the year seems to have come around. It seemed like yesterday we were talking about the 2021 review. But of course, it's been an eventful year, to say the least. I'm going to limit my comments to gas. Keith Bell, my co-author, is in the panel discussion, and he can speak to the electricity side of the equation. Regular readers of the Energy Review will know that gas security has been a constant theme, and that we've described the government's approach to gas security as being sort of gas by default, based on its assessment that the UK's got all the necessary infrastructure needed to import the gas it needs, and it benefits from a diversity of sources of supply. But as the Statutory Security of Supply report acknowledges, every year the UK relies on market forces to deliver secure and affordable supplies. This approach, although probably increasingly risky as levels of import dependence have increased, had worked until the energy price crisis in late 2021. And I think it's important to understand that the global gas market was tight coming out of the pandemic, even before we had the recent events in Europe. So we find ourselves now, after the initial energy price crisis, late 2021, and then the global gas price crisis triggered by Russia's continuation of its war in Ukraine. And so minds are focused on issues of gas security in ways they haven't been in the past. So prior to recent events, our research, which has been ongoing over a number of years, has suggested that actually the failure to plan for the changing role of gas in the UK's energy system as it transforms to achieve 2050 net zero target represented the major threat to gas security. As we put in our piece today, we need to plan for the phasing down of gas consumption while retaining the supporting infrastructure for as long as gas is needed. This is a sentiment that the International Energy Agency echoed in its World Energy Outlook in 2021. And if you go back to the 2021 net zero strategy, how many governments ago, I think two or three, you'll see that in that strategy, the government promised to consult on the issue of the changing role of gas and was going to make a decision on the future of the gas transmission system, I think in 2024. Those timetables have not changed, but the context obviously has changed markedly. But equally, the British Energy Security Strategy stated that gas demand would fall by 40% by 2030. So this is kind of implying that the current crisis is likely to accelerate the pace of demand destruction or reduction for gas in the UK, making the issue of managing the infrastructure all the more pressing. So when it comes to gas security policy, I think we're beginning to see tensions between short-term energy security, what is needed to improve the resilience of our existing system, and the medium to longer term consequences of decarbonisation. And so we have to ensure that we don't embark on making large-scale investments in the short term that will not be needed in the longer term. So I'd say that at the present, the market is delivering physical security of supply at a price that is unaffordable. But the market is working. It is delivering the physical supply of gas that we need. The infrastructure in the UK is holding up. but flows into our LNG terminals are at record levels, as are flows through the interconnectors to Belgium and the Netherlands. And the UK has played a major role in helping Europe fill up its gas storage for the winter. It's something I think Caroline will reflect on later in terms of wider relations with the EU. But the current situation has also highlighted the lack of interseasonal storage in the UK. And there was much angst when it came to the decision made back in 2017 to close the Rough storage facility. So in the midst of the crisis, the storage facility has come back online. And it's only operating about 20% this winter, but presumably it will ramp up to next winter. Only operating at 20% this winter actually represents 50% of total UK gas storage. So the question then is Rough enough to guarantee UK gas security in the short to medium term? Should we be investing in more long-term storage? At the same time, expansion is already underway at 2 of our LNG terminals at Southhook and Grain, and National Grid Transmission is having to invest in expanding capacity to carry more gas from Milford Haven. In fact, this year we saw restrictions placed on the flows of LNG out of Milford Haven. And it's probably fair to say that the current crisis is resulting in a scale and direction of flows of gas that's challenging the infrastructure. It wasn't built to move gas in these volumes, in these directions, but it's continuing to deliver. But there's always a problem when you stress infrastructure to the max, it's likely to break down. But so fingers crossed we don't have any major technical shortages this winter. But the big question is, does it make sense to invest millions in building greater resilience in the gas import infrastructure to meet the short, medium term challenges, given that the aim of our net zero policy is to accelerate the reduction in gas demand and achieve a totally green power system by 2035? Gas plays a critical energy system service, providing storage and flexibility, and it's critical to domestic heat and to key industries. And thus the future of what happens to UK gas demand is driven largely by our success or not in accelerating decarbonisation, both in terms of domestic heat and industry, but of course we're also have made major inroads into decarbonising power, and I'm sure Keith will talk more about this. Accelerating decarbonisation will mean less gas is needed, but we will need to maintain the infrastructure to ensure gas security. However, failure to make sufficient progress on decarbonisation means we will need more gas for longer, and despite the hopes of a new licensing round in the North Sea, probably more imports, exposing consumers to security supply risks and volatility. Thus, we would continue to argue that a gas by design approach is needed even more, that matches the short-term need to build resilience in the face of the current crisis against the longer-term challenge of managing falling gas demand as decarbonisation accelerates. So we're going to be continuing work on these issues. We will be publishing a report in collaboration with the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies early in the new year on LNG in UK gas security. We actually commissioned this report back in 2019 as we felt that this was kind of a missing link in our research, and I think it will shed light on how the LNG system has evolved, how it operates, and the challenges it faces. We're also going to be holding a conference in late March as part of the UKIRK's integration project on energy security and net zero. So watch this space as we continue to work on the UK's gas security challenges. You know, the consequence of a challenge is that perhaps there's a lot more interest in our research than there ever has been in the past. But I'd rather not have the crisis. So I'll leave you with those thoughts, needing to balance the short to medium term challenges of gas security against the longer term need as we phase down gas and maintaining infrastructure. Thank you.
Excellent stuff. Thanks very much, Mike. And it's interesting to what you were saying about the gas interconnectors. The electricity interconnector has obviously been running very much in our direction during the last few days. Having a look at Electric Insights, actually, wind is up this morning. Wind is back up to about 18%. And it seems as though there's a corresponding drop in electricity imports at the moment. But and apologies, I've gone into silhouette. I'm maximising the solar gain into the spare room, which means that I've gone into silhouette whilst we're speaking. Enough of this. I will pass on now to Ahmed. Thanks very much. Talk about industrial decarbonisation.
Thanks very much. I have a couple of slides. I hope it's now presenting in the screen. Can you see it, Rob?
Yeah, I can. Sorry, I just didn't unmic quickly enough, and it's in.
Okay.
That's fine.
Okay, thank you very much. So my name is Ahmed Gilani, and I'll talk about the impacts of the energy crisis on business and industry. So most industrial sector, such as food and drinks, chemicals, and the glass manufacturers rely heavily on natural gas and electricity for their industrial process, and that's to produce their products. And those energy prices have increased significantly, as you are aware. So very large gas consumers or energy intensive industries experience up to 2 times the normal price, and that's up to June 2022. And obviously that's why you see them calling for state support. So we explored the short and long-term impacts of those increases on business and industry. In terms of the short-term impacts, businesses seen strict energy contract requirements. So for example, that's include enhanced credit check or paying high security deposit upfront with the contract is limited to 1 year time. We have seen company insolvencies at record high since 2009. And in terms of the manufacturing industry, Make UK, which is the trade association of the manufacturing industry in the UK, reported that 60% of the companies actually saying that high energy costs are threatening their businesses. So this leads that 13% of the companies already reduced their hours of operation, and similar percentage already made job cuts. So the government response was really to introduce the energy bill relief scheme, which I am sure all of you are aware of, and that leads to a reduction of the total energy bills between 20 to 40% for businesses and industries. So just over half of the businesses reported that they are happy with the short-term arrangement, but there are significant uncertainties beyond April next year and what will happen after that for the manufacturing industry. In terms of the long-term impacts, we at UK developed an emission pathway for the entire UK industry from 2020 to 2050 and compared that to the Climate Change Committee balanced pathway. So what we found is that the total cumulative emissions would be increased by 155 million tonnes over the period from 2020 to 2050. So you see that shift to the right. And that is because gas prices are high. So by default, electricity prices are high. And that makes blue hydrogen and the green hydrogen are high. CCS technologies needs a lot of energy, so that also wouldn't be cost effective. And that's why you see the shift to the right. And that happens until later in the years, for example, 2035 or 2040, when electricity prices are expected to decouple from the gas prices, which make green hydrogen looks better for the industry. Or that continues until there's a high cost for emissions to be paid that encourages industrial sites to switch. So it's all related to the increase in gas prices. And what we found also is that's also delaying the investment at least by 5 years for the industry. And in terms of looking at it for the entire industrial sector, so this means that for the industrial sector, the energy trilemma triangle is now obsolete because we have security of supply issues, we're expected to be high carbon emissions, and the products, industrial products, are not so affordable considering if they consider to invest in decarbonization technologies. And with that, I conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. That was extremely interesting and completely on time as well. I've had a message that my microphone isn't great, so I can see. Okay, it's fine. It's fine. Good. So I'll continue straight on to our next speaker, Caroline.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Caroline Kazemko from the University of Warwick. I am going to talk about UK and EU energy and climate relations And this work stems from a UCAT project that's been undertaken for the past 3 years or so on the implications of Brexit for net zero energy policy and politics in the UK. And if you're interested in that question, there's a series of publications on the UCAT website, including a scenario document that we released back in October for the future of the relationship. Today, however, I'm going to talk about this relationship being at a potential inflection point. And when I say potential, I'm saying it in capital letters, basically. So what happened as a result of Brexit is that the particularly energy side of the relationship with the EU ended up being pretty much suboptimal in a number of areas, not as bad as some people had expected, but still not as good as it had been. The trade and cooperation agreement left open the possibility to renegotiate various things, but I'm going to concentrate on electricity trading rules. So the current rules are far from optimal. They are essentially default electricity trading rules. They are less economically efficient. Trade and interconnection is at the margin a little bit more costly than it was, which is obviously unhelpful at the moment. And the rate of new electricity interconnection has slowed in that 3 new interconnectors between the UK and European countries are either suspended or delayed. But what's happened here, interestingly, is that there's no end of willingness on both sides, on the energy side, to improve the relationship. It's the wider relationship that has held energy back. And when I say the wider relationship, I'm meaning mainly Northern Ireland and the decision by the UK to go ahead with the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, which currently sits in the House of Lords. But we are now seeing this thawing of the relationship. It coincides somewhat with Russia's invasion of the Ukraine and that decision taken by both the UK and the EU to phase out fossil fuel imports from Russia. So perhaps at times like this, it's sort of easier to see what you have in common. And of course, this is throwing the importance of the energy relationship, gas and electricity actually, into a new light. As Mike has mentioned, the UK has essentially been acting as a gas bridge, bringing sort of Norwegian pipeline gas and LNG gas across the UK into Europe. It was also actually a pretty heavy net exporter of electricity over the summer. And so here, this sort of the role of efficient trade across interconnectors becomes pretty vital, and it's vital now, but it's also vital in the future as grids across Europe become more reliant on renewables and you have extra balancing requirements. So this thaw in the relationship has led to a series of events. In fact, there's been an awful lot of negotiation going on, but I'll just point out a couple of things. Members of the European Parliament had a formal visit to Westminster for the first time since Brexit a month or so ago. And Prime Minister Sunak has agreed with President Biden that there will be a new Northern Ireland agreement by February of next year. So this, of course, offers opportunities for an improvement in the energy relationship. And the UK has already been allowed to rejoin the North Sea Energy Cooperation Group, which is the group that's building out vast quantities of wind in the seas between the UK and Europe. It had to leave it as a result of Brexit, but that group and those plans and the ability to coordinate is really important for both UK and EU sustainable energy and climate change policy over the next decade or so. So of course, the big question now is, does this open up the possibility to finally agree these new electricity trading rules? And it seems that there is some potential if, and I would keep an eye on, if you're interested in these things, on the protocol bill and if it does start passing back through the Lords or not, and if, of course, there is a new Northern Ireland agreement. This is by far not a given. The UK may have to cross 1 or 2 red lines in order to get this agreement. And so what's happening is that overall energy stays tied to this wider relationship between the UK and the EU. but renewing close energy and climate ties really makes sense on affordability, climate mitigation and security grounds, all of which both sides recognise as vital at the moment. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Caroline. We are now going to some respondents. I've just been having a quick look at the QA box, and we've already got some great questions coming in. So please do keep those questions coming in, and keep upvoting them, because I'll use that as the principal means by which to decide which questions to ask first. But before we open it to wider Q&A, we've got 3 invited respondents, and so Keith McLean, over to you. Thanks for coming.
Okay, thanks, Rob. So as always, a well-researched and reasoned summary of the main issues that we've seen over this incredibly difficult period. I think what it's done is bring to a head some of the challenges that we as a nation have in managing and developing such a complicated energy system, and whether it's being driven by climate change, energy security, or affordability. We have to recognise that the system will need to be changed significantly over the coming years and decades. But rather than going into any of the individual policy issues, I'm just going to take some of the common issues that have arisen from this across other countries, as well as some that are of our own making, and reflect on this report and the themes that have also come up in previous years. I'm also going to reflect on some statements that were made from another event last week, and it is related. It was Keith Bell and his colleagues from the Climate Change Committee commenting on Scotland's performance over the last year. Raggy, not picking on you in particular, because I think most of the points that it made could be aimed at most places in the UK with equal validity. But what they said was that the ambition was great, but it must be deliverable. And unfortunately, there was no credible explanation of how to reach the ambitious targets. That there was magical thinking going on, living in a model, not the real world. We're running out of time, and that ministers are not hearing the messages. And I would certainly add to that for the UK, that most of the ministers that we have are not in the job long enough even to understand their brief sufficiently, even if they are hearing what the message is. So there's some really significant issues in there. And I think they relate to 2 main themes. One is around decisions, and one is about delivery. And on decision making, I think what we've seen over this year, as well as previously, obviously, is that the common theme is that the approach that we tend to have in the UK is reactive and short term. It tends to be very much siloed rather than joined up and looking across the piece. And we avoid or delay dealing with the difficult trade-offs and making those difficult decisions that have to be made. So we must become much more strategic in our decision making, but maintain sufficient flexibility, obviously, to deal with emerging issues. We need to have a clearer focus on the longer term and coordinate the approach that is being taken across all of those who are involved. And we need to address the trade-offs quickly. The problems don't go away, and they usually just get worse. So there isn't a benefit other than perhaps it's somebody else's problem in the future, but that's not really a successful way for us to manage what we need to do. Again, a common theme in the Climate Change Committee's work is highlighting the policy gaps. But I think increasingly we see that we also have delivery gaps as well, that even where we've got policies in place, we're not delivering against those, and therefore the overall gap is just opening up. I think what we also need to understand is that the policies that we're looking at are not just about the end state, but there needs to be a pathway within those. And we need to consider the delivery and the deliverability as a core part of the policy process, and not just a bolt-on at the end. And within the policy work, the how is just as important as the what. So if you take the example perhaps of the Green Deal, where I think anybody would have argued with the aspirations of it, the methodology that was chosen to roll that out was not appropriate, and it failed spectacularly. And another example I would give is smart meters, where we have seen in almost every other country in Europe, they have chosen a different route to roll it out. Most of them have done it successfully. Most of them have done it relatively quickly. And that certainly can't be said for the mode of rolling it out through energy suppliers in the UK. So delivery and deliverability must be part of that policy process. And overall, the final point I would make is around the governance that we need to have in place to deal with all of this. For decision making, I think we need to be clearer about what requires a political decision and make sure that we get those political decisions. But thereafter, we need to allow those with the appropriate competence to take the policy and the delivery and to take that forward from there. We need to ensure that there's sufficient resource and skills to make policy, and then I would say separately for delivery. A lot of the time we try and get those who have a lot of experience in policy development to also get involved in the delivery, and that just the different set of skills. We need to recognize that and make sure that we have a handover at some point to make sure that the delivery is properly looked after. We need to ensure that there's sufficient regulatory and legislative capacity for enacting the policies. I think we will find in the coming years that we have a massive challenge of finding the legislative space to put forward all of the necessary legislation. And we also need to remember that there are the enabling processes like planning and consenting must be aligned with what we're doing. And again, if necessary, suitable legislative and regulatory action taken. A common theme that I keep coming back to is the need to recognise the need for supporting infrastructure. Can only underline the points that Mike was making earlier on. It's not enough just to look at the production and usage of energy. We need to look at how we will transport it and how we will store it to make sure that there is enough of it where we need it and when we need it. And finally, I think we need to, after having got to a point of delivery, have skilled and trusted delivery authorities to oversee. And I say authorities deliberately because there will be some things that need to be done centrally. There'll be others that need to be done locally. And there needs to be the resource and the competence in those to deal with it. And it needs to be sufficiently trusted at a central or a local level and have a license to operate. I hope with that we can then maybe change the CCC's theme of magical thinking into magical delivery. Thank you.
Right. Okay then. No small agenda to follow there then, Keith, but fantastic. And I'm sure we'll pick up on those in many of those issues in the discussion that follows. So handing over now to Dara to give us the industry or the Energy UK, or the Dara view with.
Thank you. Thanks, Rob.
Okay.
Let's go with that.
Okay.
I don't know really how to follow Keith, because like everything he said, I was sort of like putting lines through my notes. So I don't want to say the same things, but I did kind of have kind of three themes, which were investment and investability in the market. You touched a little bit on windfall, the windfall tax, and that's going to have a huge impact on investment in power generation. It completely changes the case for merchant investment in renewable energy, and also, you know, against the backdrop where investors are less interested in investing in infrastructure type things and more interested in investing in more liquid assets like gilts and bonds. So there's a very different investment case now because of the windfall tax, and that is something I think we need to work through quite carefully if we want to continue to grow energy supply, particularly low carbon clean energy supply in this country, which is what we should be doing. And there's an international aspect to that, because the IRA in America makes investing in America a far more attractive proposition. So on the power supply side, I think investment is, we've still got some work to do to make the UK attractive, or as attractive as it was 6, 12, 18 months ago, because the political turmoil of the last 4 or 5 months has had a huge impact on investor confidence. I think we talk a lot about investment in power generation. We don't talk enough about investment in the retail side of the market. And actually, right now, the retail energy suppliers, most of them don't make profit. And if they do, it's a small amount from the retail parts of their business. That has to change if we want these suppliers to be the ones who can innovate and get people to make those net zero changes to homes. Energy efficiency is, of course, a huge part of that. And you touched on that, Rob, but it's also about getting that kind of DSR, flex, smart product services, those sorts of things in people's homes. So we're using energy when it's cheapest, most plentiful. And it's also about decarbonising heat. So, there's this whole package of things that we're expecting regular folks to do, and retail suppliers could play a huge part of that, but they're not equipped to right now. And there's lots of roadblocks in the way. And frankly, it's not really an attractive market to investing. So I think investment in energy is this huge theme that we're going to have to come back to and return to over and over again in the coming year, if we want to be kind of globally competitive. And I think it does beg the question of reaching net zero if we're not an attractive country when it comes to investment. I think Keith made some really good points about regulatory policy, government and legislative type frameworks. One of the things I was reflecting on during Ahmed's presentation was that sort of, non-domestic contracts for businesses are very different to domestic contracts. And whilst energy suppliers do want to support their non-domestic customers, it's a B2B activity, which is very different to that domestic relationship that you have where you've got the price cap, and households, yes, they behave differently, have different energy usage, but they're all, regular people. Whereas businesses, your profile is very different if you're a pub versus an office versus a hospital versus a school. So, they are tailored. They're based on risk, those contracts, and the value is significant. They can be up to tens of thousands of pounds, potentially millions each year, depending on different. So there's no one size fits all response or approach to business support. And whilst what the government's done is absolutely crucial, particularly as we enter a recession, we have to think really carefully about how to support high risk businesses and how much of that risk is then borne by the energy supplier, and what happens there, because actually these are huge amounts of money we're talking about. Costs can't be smoothed out, upfront payments might be needed. Failure for business does then raise a cost for everybody else. So there's lots of complexity, I think, in business energy supply that we need to be working through as the government's bill relief scheme comes to an end. And I'm really interested in having a conversation about that, Ahmed, because I thought that you made some really good points in that space, particularly about energy intensive users, because those knock-on impacts have ramifications across the entire economy. I'm going to pause there so there's time for proper questions and Q&A, Rob.
Cool, that's great, Dara. Lots of interesting stuff there, and I'm really pleased to be able to say that investment and understanding investors has been a theme that UKIRC has made a particular effort to engage with, not just in this phase but in previous phases. So often completely ignored by academic economists in the energy industry, and I'm particularly pleased that we can have a case study of the pub as a prospective business user in future. So I look forward to pursuing that one. Moving on now to Raggy, who I can see, but I can't see. So Raggy, are you with us?
I am here, yeah.
Okay, good.
Sorry, I have some very low solar gain at the moment, just probably for the next 5 minutes, unfortunately. So I'm Deputy Director at the Scottish Government in our Directorate for Energy and Climate Change, and going to just give a few reflections on the review and maybe pick up a couple of points that have been raised already by other respondents. I wanted to speak a little bit about cost and affordability, and then to pick up the theme of sort of the relationship between short-term decision-making or perhaps emergency sort of immediate decision making, and the longer term pathway to net zero, and ensuring that the two are aligned and that we're not inadvertently building more barriers for the longer term through our short term actions. On affordability and cost, I thought the review was great at highlighting some of the risks, and certainly those are reflected in what we see happening in Scotland. We are concerned about the for domestic consumers that the higher price cap from April 2023 is going to be unsustainable for many households. Our analysis suggests it's going to be 970,000 fuel poor households in Scotland. So that's almost 40% of all Scottish households will be fuel poor from April 2023, which is a real stain on our general social justice policy, and a really serious issue for the economy and society as a whole. Whilst the UK government has made some additional benefits payments available, one-off payments that they announced back in November, we do need to see something that's more permanent than just those one-off temporary fixes, particularly as energy prices are forecast to be high for the foreseeable future. I just pick up on a couple of things that I suppose Rob, you mentioned, and also Keith, on delivery and energy efficiency advice and funding. As the review says, the Scottish Government has a long-standing funding arrangement and an advice service for all sorts of domestic and non-domestic consumers on energy efficiency and heat decarbonisation. And we recently converted our loans for domestic consumers into straightforward grants, which we hope will both be more attractive and also increase uptake. So households can now get combined grants of up to £15,000 for heat pumps and energy efficiency improvements, and that's boosted to 18,000 in rural postcodes. We've also increased the amount of capacity that our energy advice services have. So we've got around 130,000 households capacity to advise this year, which is an additional sort of 14,000 over last year. We are also widening access to our area-based schemes and our Warmer Home Scotland scheme, which is specifically targeted at the fuel poor, to ensure that an additional 100,000 households are eligible. And we've increased the amount of funding available through our SME loan scheme. So that's to speak to some of Dara's examples of small businesses that are really struggling under the current retail market arrangements. Just to pick up on energy intensive industries and industrial decarbonisation, really interesting points in the review, particularly some of the data there on the impacts on manufacturing in particular. And certainly that is very much aligned with what we see happening in Scotland. Some of our larger manufacturing sites are having serious difficulty in procuring and negotiating new energy contracts. We are seeing cash deposits being required, putting businesses at risk, businesses closing down operations temporarily over the winter months, or releasing employees, which, as Ahmed said, is a very serious concern. So we need to have a better system of supporting those industries. And we also need to address the point that Ahmed made really well around the risk that we are disincentivizing investment in decarbonisation of those very industries that we need to see decarbonise rapidly. Just to reflect finally on that point about the relationship between short term and long term, whilst all of the sort of impacts of the acute crisis that we're facing need immediate redress, there is a need at the same time to, and I think Keith picked this up as well, keep the strategic objectives that we have around net zero in mind, and ensure that as we take immediate action, we're not complicating or hindering that pathway to net zero and the transition for the energy system overall, whether that's in terms of the immediate incentives that we are putting into the system for the sort of consumer end, or whether it's in terms of the wholesale market interventions, the design of a windfall tax and the incentives that are then feed through to investors. So I would very much agree with those points that others have made, that longer term vision and the end goal that we're trying to get to, we absolutely need to keep in sight all the time whilst we're taking short term action.
Thanks, Raggy. Really, really interesting as ever to hear. I know it's partly personal, but also Scottish government perspective. So we're going to move now to QA. I forgot in my introductions to introduce Anthony Froggatt, who's co-author with Caroline and is from Chatham House. And a huge experience of a range of these issues, but particular focus on some of the EU relationships in this context. So, we've got 158 participants. I think we had 280 odd people register, which is a record for an event that we've run on our own, although we had even more for the events we ran jointly on this crisis topic with the Energy Institute and the RANG earlier in the year. And 17 questions already in the QA box. We won't probably get through all of them. Can I ask all of the panelists to make sure they can see the QA, order them by most up votes, because that's the way that I will take them. And I will be essentially just reading them out. If there's a couple that look similar, or some that look similar, I might try and cluster them. And obviously upvoting is a popularity contest that you can take part in whenever you are playing on Zoom. So Mark Winskell, one of our UCUT collaborators from the University of Edinburgh, you win this morning by asking, how can UK interseasonal energy demand variation be best met, if not by natural gas? Austin Short's question is a bit similar. But I might think of what I might do is take them both slightly separately. So, and if you'd like to have a go at that, could you please either just unmic or use raised hands? And if I don't notice your raised hands because I'm an idiot, then just unmic and speak. Keith Bell.
Well, good morning and very good questions. And yeah, I mean, we could continue to use natural gas. The key question then is, how do we use it in such a way that we don't have carbon emissions associated with it? For security of supply purposes, for kind of meeting the last few hours of demand, or the last few megawatt hours of demand for a few hours a year, actually to use unabated natural gas might not be so much of an issue. It's not going to make a huge difference in the overall scheme of things, but the importance of reliable supply of energy is such that we might take that relatively small hit, compensated for in other sectors. So natural gas could still have a significant role to play. I mean, it can have a role to play, of course, if we use it with carbon capture. But the other thing, of course, that people are talking about as being a substantially decarbonized means of storing energy, use surplus low carbon energy when it's windy and sunny, turn it into hydrogen, store it, and then turn it back into electricity at the times, as mentioned, these kind of wind droughts, the kind of Dunkelflaute circumstances. So we need the storage capacity, we need the conversion capacity. The round trip efficiency isn't brilliant, but then you've got to think, what else is there? What other means have we got? So there are options. It's not without challenges in terms of cost. Technologically, it's perfectly feasible, I think. But we've got to get on and invest in the infrastructure to enable it via whichever of these options or combinations that we think of. Before I hand over to others, I can see Anthony and Keith got their hands up. The nuclear question, I mean, certainly that would help. You've got extra generation capacity, which is available to you when it's not windy and sunny, but it's very difficult to turn down or turn off the output from nuclear power stations. So you make the surplus even bigger at the times when you've got that surplus, and you have to be able to use that up. Otherwise, you've got the conversion into hydrogen or whatever it might happen to be. or exports make use of the interconnectors. That's another really important part of it, by the way. Very complementary of, say, hydro resources in Norway, allows them to kind of save the water for the times when it's most useful, and they can use our wind energy and potentially nuclear energy when it's in a surplus. So yeah, it can help with the deficit conditions, but makes the surplus bigger.
Yeah, understood, and very clearly put. Thanks very much, Keith. I should say that this wider question of flexibility provision is going to be a major focus for UKIRK, integrating research over the next few months and towards the end of the current phase, which is in 2024. I think the order of the hands were Anthony and then the other Keith. So Anthony first.
Yeah, just very briefly, and yeah, I think Keith largely covered it. I mean, I was just stressed the interconnectors. I mean, it is, I think people are quite surprised that since Brexit, we've nearly doubled the interconnect capacity to the continent. So there was a bit of a hiatus. Some of the projects, in particular France, were slowed down, but it's now continuing at pace. And the geographical diversity, Keith mentioned Norway. So the first interconnect to Norway, we're now looking to Germany. So this does create a opportunity for large movements of electricity to support peaks in demands and peaks in supply. It's worth just emphasizing that if we're going to operate those efficiently, then it raises the question about the UK reintegrating in terms of the internal energy market or the equivalent, therefore, harmonizing rules, etc. So there are regulatory steps that will be needed as well as investment steps. But absolutely, in terms of the need for a flexible system requires a whole range of different technologies and regulation.
Okay, thanks, Anthony. Perhaps a bit more challenging in the context of some political aspirations for energy independence, but a separate session on that seems to me to be something that we should be thinking about for the new year. Keith.
Yeah, okay. Thanks. I'll just add to what the others have said. I'm particularly emphasising the point that Mark is making here about the interseasonal storage. And I would stretch that out further because actually into year variability, if you add that into wind and solar, as well as to consumption patterns, which are different from year to year, the amounts that we need are very significant. And it's the order of magnitude of energy and capacity that we need that is an enormous challenge. And all that I would ask for is that when we are evaluating and comparing different options, that we don't just focus on something like the round trip efficiency, which may be one of the statistics, but that we look at the overall costs and the overall deliverability of the solutions. And remember things like if you have got a fuel, generally they're much cheaper to move around than electricity, and fuels are massively less expensive to store than electricity in the form of batteries or pumped hydro or whatever you want. So let's make sure, as UKIRK is set up to do, that we look at the whole system's solution and the whole system's costs of doing that when we are looking at these, and not just on something like the round trip efficiency.
Yeah, Keith, completely understood and a very good answer. Before we leave this topic, because there were two questions that were quite closely linked, Keith Bell spoke to the nuclear version of this. So there was a question that was by Austin Short. One of the things that Austin says is that hydrogen is wishful thinking at this stage. I'm not aware of an option that potentially offers what hydrogen might offer in terms of the volume of storage or a kind of alternative gaseous fuel. I think that's the key thing that we need. Would any of the panel like to take the challenge that hydrogen is wishful thinking? And perhaps who haven't yet spoken, Ahmed, do you want to have any thoughts on that from your perspective, for example?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's for industry, it's absolutely relevant to replace natural gas or other fuels that are fossil intensive. But yeah, the key thing is where do you get like the clean electricity from, or how do you get it to work with CCS. So the economics of it would play a key role in defining the hydrogen like role in the future. But yeah, we see it for the industry, it's absolutely essential, but also more focus on the side of the electrification side of things for the processes. There are some processes in certain sectors that can be electrified, doesn't necessarily need hydrogen, but they are at very low TRLs. So if for example, those in the future came to market maturity, then you could argue against hydrogen. But for now, I think hydrogen is essential for the industry.
But do you think it's wishful thinking, or do you think that it's a feasible option?
I think it's a feasible option.
Okay, thank you. Raggy, your hand. Keith McLean, your hand went up and came back down again. Did you want to say something about hydrogen too? I'm going to go to Raggy first.
Yeah, I think Keith was before me, but it was a very quick point really, which is to say absolutely feasible. And just to pick up, I think Caroline mentioned inflection point in terms of where we are with EU energy policy. It's, I think, the same on hydrogen. There's a point now at which we need to bring government finance and funding and in lockstep with private investment and make this happen. It's absolutely feasible, but it does require a lot of clever thinking and good policy design.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Clear. Thank you, Keith.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what the previous speakers have said, that hydrogen production, hydrogen transport, particularly in pipelines, hydrogen storage, particularly in salt caverns, is standard technology. We produce hydrogen in relatively large quantities for industrial purposes. We store it for that. We transport it around for that. So there is absolutely nothing technologically challenging about doing that. The challenge is quite rightly one of cost, and at what cost it can be done. And that is a particular challenge around the production and the production of green rather than blue hydrogen. But to be honest, if I were to have a challenge, I'd rather take that one on than the one of making batteries big enough and safe enough to store the electricity that we need for the interseasonality that we had in the other. I think we've seen enormous battery improvements, but I think there's a belief that they're beginning to bottom out or to top out. Whereas in hydrogen production, we've not even started going through the process that we did, for instance, with offshore wind, where through the scaling up, through the standardization, we have decimated the costs, and we're very proud of that. We've done that with solar as well, and it's been through that volume. So rather than seeing the size of the challenge as the problem, I think the size of the challenge is almost the opportunity to make the differences in cost that are needed to get to a more competitive cost structure than we have at the moment.
Yeah, thanks for that, Keith. And I think also, batteries and potential hydrogen storage fulfill very different system functions. Batteries are incredibly useful in some of the things that they're able to do uniquely, in fact, in terms of the instantaneous response and system balancing, which is what has been driving their installation in grid-connected applications recently and will continue to do so. I'm going to change topic now. We've got Tim Brownholtz-Spite's question. I've probably mispronounced that, but so apologies. Change of topic. What will it take for the government to commit to a long-term investment in energy efficiency retrofit? And it will bring many good things: skilled jobs, save people money, improve their health. Any suggestions as to why we are still waiting? Who would like to have a go at that one? Caroline.
This is obviously such an interesting question, because the consensus has been so loud that is what is needed at this moment in time, and obviously from earlier in this year. But even now, looking forward into a 2023 and a potentially 2024 of high prices, it just seems like a no-brainer. And this is going to sound a bit touchy-feely, my answer here, actually, but I do think that this government is not confident in its abilities to do this properly. It's had a series of pretty inefficient, somewhat failed, somewhat mistaken energy efficiency policies that haven't gone particularly well. And I think that they have a very low confidence in their ability to be able to do it properly. So you might, disturb people in their homes, which is something that ideologically this government doesn't want to do, but then it may be for not so much of a result. So personally, I just don't think they have the confidence and they seem to be wanting to just push it out as much as they can. So that's my insight.
Okay, so a lack of political something, not quite competence, capability.
Well, a lack of belief in their own capabilities to do it efficiently.
Yeah, okay. Dara?
I think that's a fair enough point. I do think that there is a question around governments. Maybe the right word is bravery in making a decision and delivering, but the reality is it's not government that will deliver. It's going to be industry and all of the other parts of kind of that fairly kind of complicated supply chain, because it needs to respond to the incredibly diverse UK housing stock. But it's not just housing stock, it's tenure, it's income, it's fairness. So, and that's a theme, I think, part of the energy transition. And we talk about having, still aspiring to have a just transition, it's fairness. And, who gets help and when, and how do you incentivize people to make these changes if they can actually afford to? Today's energy prices should have had a kind of real been a catalyst, I think, to improving energy efficiency, and I think it has been for a lot of people. And I guess for me, I think there's a couple of things. Government has put forward this Eco Plus proposal. Part of it includes an expectation on customer contribution. We're asking people to contribute, and I'm not saying that they shouldn't contribute. That's absolutely not the point I'm making. But the bureaucracy of these sorts of things and the tight timescales to deliver and meet the obligation, as opposed to it being a voluntary scheme, is already a concern for suppliers. And the consultation's due in just before Christmas. Very short consultation period. The reality is that it is about delivering cheap single measures to a wider group of people. Absolutely support it. Glad government's put some money there. I actually don't think it's a bad thing to have a customer contribution, but with a tight timescale to deliver, we have to recognise and acknowledge people's circumstances right now, because it's not just energy bills that are putting pressure on household incomes. It's the fact that mortgages are going up. It's the fact that rent's going up. It's the fact that food's costing more, transport's costing more. So, energy efficiency and these sorts of programs, I think we do need to have this long-term outlook, which we just haven't had. And that is where eco has been successful. Has it been amazing? Probably not. Has it delivered the volume we need? No, it was never meant to, right? It's targeted at a certain group of people. But what it has been able to do is be multi-parliament. And I think that goes back to Caroline's point, is that we need a way of doing this that is not impacted by politics because of that chop and change and the constant way of doing it. We need a consistent delivery mechanism. And it's the only place where that supply chain has been able to build up, and that's where skills have been able to build up. I don't think suppliers are the answer to improving the energy efficiency of every single household in the UK, but I think that they're a good place to start for a certain group of consumers and to expand out, because it's proven that there's some continuity there. Because we've all seen the graphs, haven't we? Certain CESP and then boom, so there is something around the only thing that's delivered has been eco. How do we build on that? Because we're not starting from scratch.
Yeah, and I'm reading down the list of questions, and we got the one from David Vincent asking about the last 10 years. And one of the things that happened within the last 10 years is that eco, with a wider remit, not just on the most sort of energy poor consumers, was killed off without a replacement. And I think that there's been that gap for, we call them the able to pay, which the reasons that you've just described is probably a misnomer, but certainly that kind of owner-occupier and wider set of households is a key policy gap that we've seen. Slightly less so in Scotland, which is why I'm going to bring Raggy in before Keith Bell, if you don't mind, Keith. I was going to point at her, but luckily she put her hand up.
Yeah. No, I won't repeat. I won't repeat what I've already said about the schemes that exist in Scotland and have done for many years. So we don't have that 10-year gap, which is not to say that they are perfect or that they are big enough. What I did want to say was just to make people aware, we have launched a delivery agency, and this I think speaks to Keith McLean's point earlier about the difference between policy people and delivery people and the skill sets required in each. So we are transitioning over the course of this Scottish Parliament, so out to the end of 2024 into 2025, we will have a setup, a distinct, we call it bricks and mortar, but a delivery agency that is going to coordinate all of the heat and energy efficiency delivery work that's happening across Scotland and bring together the existing schemes under one umbrella organisation with a real delivery focus and delivery competence, as Keith was suggesting. So I think one to watch, be interested in external critical friend views on how that takes shape and how we can improve it as we build it.
Okay, well, look no further for a critical friend, but Keith Bell.
Well, I think I'll just pick up on a few and just sort of emphasize some points that have been made already. Consumers are not one homogenous group, so there are owner occupiers, some are wealthy, some are not so wealthy, and the key is about how we support those without the wealth, and then also to make it easy for any of them, any householder to get the work done. So getting access to the information we've talked about, some kind of delivery agency that might maybe part of the role is through which private investors can go. So, and a lot of this is really important to say as well. It's going to be about private investment, and then the help with financing of that. So, low cost loans or green mortgages or whatever the mechanism happens to be, provided you know how to spend the money. And that's, I think, a key thing now, and getting the supply chain up and running, and it's scaling up. It can be, very welcome, what Raggy is saying about a delivery agency to see whether it's really got the scale and the capability to deliver. One could argue it should have already been in place. We kind of wouldn't start from here, but okay, great. Let's now get that up and running. And the scale point is really important. Welcome as a $7,500 grant towards a heat pump in Scotland is the funding that's available for it only supports about 5,500 of them. And by the mid-2020s, we should be doing around 100,000 a year, to kind of deliver on the kind of the scale of the climate change policy that the Scottish Government has set out.
Okay, so I think that, and we are embarking upon one of our systematic reviews for energy efficiency for what we will find a better term for than the able to pay. And there's so many different strands of this that we could pick up on, and reflecting on the role of suppliers, for example, Dara, which goes back to your opening remarks and is clearly something that I think we all need to pay attention to at the moment. And I should probably also mention, or I should mention our kind of the CREDS consortium that works alongside, focuses more on energy demand reduction. And we all know that all of the above is the answer to energy efficiency because of the multiple non-price market failures that we see for implementing it, everything from information to access to capital to trust in the providers of energy efficiency in your home. I would, personal anecdotes should be avoided, but the principal reason that I've not gone for solid wall is I just don't know who I should trust not to, bugger things up and cause damp in my house, for example. So, and that's widely shared. Just to give a warning, I think we'll have time for this. There's not the next question, but one from David Vincent is asking for someone to do an overview of 10 years of energy policy. If anyone, you're on notice, those of you who might have that overview, I could have a go at it. But if anyone else wants to put their hand up for it, then please do. But before we get to that, Jonathan Radcliffe, market is working, supply is meeting demand at a very high price. As Mike was emphasizing, the question is, basically, can we rely on the market to do it? Can there be a real market, inverted commas, in energy with the levels of intervention that are needed to reach net zero without everything else going wrong. Anyone would like to have a go at that one? Mike?
I'm not entirely sure what a real market means in the first instance. I mean, I think this is I don't disagree with the underlying proposition. You know, climate change is market failure. The costs or the externalities are not reflected in what we pay for fossil fuel energy services. My comments were actually specific to the LNG market, where price signals and the laws of supply and demand are delivering physical security of supply, but at a very high price. I'm not quite sure how we take this. I think most of us would agree that this is a challenge. Is why we have the problem of climate change in the context of a fossil fuel energy system. We also have a scale of market intervention already that at times is quite mind-boggling. And I was in a conversation last week, as was Caroline, with the Oxford Institute of Energy Studies, discussing what might happen in the European gas market, where Brussels is talking about intervention at the scale of a price cap and the unforeseen consequences of that. Now, of course, we do have emissions trading systems. We're putting a price on carbon, though it's not economy-wide. So I'm not really sure. I agree with the proposition, but it is the problem, isn't it? The only answer is to move away from a fossil fuel-based system, accepting, of course, that renewables also come with their own externalities. And are we pricing those into the current and future cost of renewables? So at one level, yes, absolutely. My comments were quite specific, but I doubt any of us has the answer to this question, but it's well made.
Yeah, I'm just going to make a very quick remark of my own, Keith, Belle, if you'll forgive me before I come to you. And I'd make the observation that markets can take many forms, and the role of government intervening in markets can also take many forms. And I think we should try not to be too preoccupied with the idea that there's a kind of an idealized form of market, which is an energy-only market, short-term spot market type approach, with or without an externality adder. We've seen the advantage of offering an intervention that offers long-run contracts in the form of CFDs to mobilize investment, get the cost of capital down, and get the cost of the kit down through running an auction. That is still a market, and it's revealing, hopefully, long-run marginal cost, notwithstanding the risk of winner's curse with over-enthusiastic bidding. And we know that the kind of investment needs, for example, for storage, interseasonal hydrogen, new long-duration storage, is quite different from the investment case for a battery. And the market that drove the battery investment in the first instance was the system services that are procured by the system operator, not energy price arbitrage. So I think we need to be much more sophisticated in thinking about what we mean by a market and what the kind of intervention points are, and move away from the kind of A-level economics answer to this, which is there's a market, it's in its purest possible form, which is energy only, and the intervention should be to price carbon, and then everything else will just magically, if ever there was an example of magical thinking, that is it. Keith.
So I would agree with a lot, perhaps all of what you just said, Rob. So thanks for making those points. Saved me the bother, I suppose. Right. But I mean, yeah, the point of it, there's multiple markets here, and for some of these markets, it's actually very difficult for an end user of energy to articulate the need or to understand the need. Like, for example, keeping the electricity system stable, or how do you price in, Dunkelflaute risk over a kind of 10, 20-year period? It's very, very hard to do that. So we kind of, in a way, trust some agency to do that on our behalf, and there's a kind of policy decision that is in inverted commas in our long-term best interests collectively. So yeah, it's to reinforce your point, Rob, about the kind of the purity or otherwise of markets. To come maybe a bit back to Jonathan's question of how these externalities can be built in. I mean, yeah, and what Mike said, that's the major problem in terms of global fossil fuel markets. They're not priced in, but there are some movements towards doing something about it. So I think the European Parliament, for example, was it last week or the week before, passed some bill to do with carbon border adjustment mechanisms. I think at least in principle, and I think there's more work to be done on how that works. So for the sort of products that a limited number of products that have high levels of embodied carbon emissions. So that's kind of a mechanism that could play a part, and maybe Caroline or Anthony could say more about that if we've got time. Another aspect I'll just mention is about the legacy policy costs. So, Keith talked about how we've kind of created a market for renewables, and at such scale, that's helped to bring down the cost of renewables. But we still got the sort of legacy costs. It's something that someone mentioned in the chat or this Q&A much earlier. What are those legacy costs, and can they be brought down? But then also, where are they levied? So electricity is the lowest carbon form of energy that we can get at the moment, depending on how it's produced, and yet it's being kind of in a way taxed for being kind of good, whereas you could maybe, I think the CCC has made this argument about shifting those kind of legacy costs away from electricity onto fossil fuels. Now that's a difficult position where we're the high cost of energy right now, but as a medium to long term thing, it seems kind of more should be driving us more towards the lower carbon solution. And Rob, you're quite right to mention, there's the energy system cost. So the kind of simple levelized cost of energy from renewables is low. How are the markets structured? Can we see the benefits of those low costs? Are we still heavily dependent on the marginal cost of gas? And there was a question earlier about windfall taxes on renewables producers. And then the question I think that Aoife has raised in the Q&A about storage links back to what we said earlier. There's investment needed there, as Keith was discussing earlier, and that does need to be paid for. So it means that the simple levelized cost of energy from renewables is not the total cost. Yeah.
Okay, look, Keith and Caroline, your hand has come up, but I'm actually quite keen to try and get some more questions in, if that's if you don't mind. I think the wrong question has disappeared, actually. So Jonathan's question has been answered. David Vincent's question, I was giving warning that we were going. Somebody should volunteer to answer, and then I want to try and catch a few of these. I'm scrolling down. The one from Marshall, and then there's a couple around LMP and other things that I thought it might be interesting to bring in. Does anyone want to do a 10-year retrospective, or a quick answer to David's question about what's gone well and what's not gone so well?
Well, a quick answer of what's gone well is the emissions intensity of electricity production has halved, more or less.
Yeah.
So that's a great success, and we've not really noticed it in a sense in terms of reliability of supply. A lot of the resilience issues are at kind of local network level rather than at the kind of electricity production level.
Yeah. Anyone want to add anything to that? Energy efficiency policy has not gone well. I think we all agree. Dara?
I mean, it hasn't. I think it's really interesting because actually if we go back probably more like 12, 13 years ago, we had the Ofgem probe into the retail market, and then we had retail market review, and then in 2016 we had CMA intervention. And the point I think that we should make in the retail space on this is around switching and competition, and how people and consumers, domestic consumers, engage with energy has gone on this radical journey where we went from having 6, 7, 8, 9 suppliers to having at one point over 60, and now condensing down to a smaller group again. That's been a huge journey. We've been kind of in a period where switching is the main way that you measure engagement in this market, and it's the way you consider competition based on how much you charge, on a tariff on a per kilowatt hour. In order to get to net zero, I think we need to radically change that relationship that people have with energy in their homes, and also with businesses have with the way they use and interact with energy. It's not just domestic consumers. So I'd say, 10 years of energy policy in the retail space has taken us on quite a wild ride, culminating in, 30 suppliers going out of business, at least £4 billion on everybody's bills as a result of the solar process, questions being asked of regulation in this space when it comes to regulation and consumer protection, who's carrying the, who's carrying the can, who's paying for all of this. Obviously, you'll all have seen lots of press around the cost of the statutory authorization with, you know, bulbs. So massive questions about cost, massive questions about that relationship people have with their supplier. And frankly, a huge question now with the energy price guarantee about competition in this market, because the price cap, which was primarily introduced to target the concern around a loyalty penalty for people who chose not to switch, is now acting as a reference price for the energy price guarantee, which is government subsidizing everybody's energy bill. We have very little competition in terms of switching at the moment. Most people are on a default tariff cap, price cap with their supplier. We need to radically reframe the relationship people have with their energy supplier. So it is about a more, you know, a relationship based on more than just supply to your home, but is about, you know, what is that product or service like? What is your heat pump or your, you know, EV charger? Or do you have a great time of use tariff and a brilliant app? And do you get some products with it that help? You know, what is that? How do we radically change this relationship so that retail energy suppliers can thrive and actually properly participate and compete, but we're also protecting people, and fundamentally everyone can participate in the market, get their homes to net zero, regardless of income, tenure, and all the points we've made. So, you know, 10 years in that, I mean, when we talk about the market, there's so many different aspects of the market, and that's specifically on the retail side. I think it's been absolutely like kind of up, you know, if you're kind of talking about the highs and lows, loads of highs and lows and lots of learning. The next bit needs to be about decarbonising heat. It needs to be about energy efficiency, and it needs to be about demand side response.
So could I ask Keith and Mike to be very, very succinct in their answers so that we can get at least one more question in? Thank you, Dara.
Yeah, I just wanted to make one positive point on energy efficiency. Actually, through regulation, we have done an awful lot. We achieved a lot with appliance standards, with equipment standards, light bulbs, and so on. We achieved an awful lot with regulation around condensing boilers. Rather, you know, they get a lot of criticism, but actually the savings that have been made by more efficient boilers, by heating controls, and regulating the solution rather than incentivizing people to do it. So that's an important issue there, is again, not just about the policy, but how it's implemented, and doing it through regulation where there isn't any choice may not always be popular, but it's incredibly effective.
Yeah, and although you have not been our advisory board chair for quite 10 years, it's probably now, before we run out of time, I'm going to thank you for that slightly less than 10 years, incredibly helpful role that you've played, Keith. And we look forward to finding new ways to engage with you going forward. Okay, we're down to our last 4 minutes. Mike, quick response.
Yeah, just very quickly on the gas side. I think we're, you know, obviously we're consuming less gas than we were, but we're less secure, and it's probably down to this lack of interseasonal storage. We have seen the closure of Rough, and that's left us exposed, particularly post-Brexit. But I wanted just to make a final comment to say, okay, it is very interesting and useful to look back, and maybe if we do an audit of what we've achieved, what is more sobering is to look forward 10 years in what we've said we need to do. And if we're at an inflection point and we don't want to waste a crisis, we need to get beyond our paper transitions. And it's all about delivery, because the pace of progress in the last 10 years is nowhere near where we need to be. So if it's a useful exercise, it should be a sobering exercise.
Yeah, very good. So it was a great question, David. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to take, before I take the last question, can I please encourage everybody to fill in the feedback form that is being circulated in some way. Very, very important to us that we get information. Yeah, there's a short form that's coming round, I think, as we speak. Onshore wind and solar. Who'd like to take? Sorry, I was raising my voice as if I'm Robert Peston or something. Who'd like to have a go at the kind of resolving the ever vacillating political issues around? Why is it so politically difficult? Can we fix that? Caroline, do you want to give us a quick political science? No.
Well, I mean, it has to do with voter bases, doesn't it? I mean, let's face it, it's not a particularly complex answer to that question, I'm afraid, and that is very much tied into the current political incumbents in this country. I think they find it very difficult to do things that are visible to their constituents, and the way that electricity, I guess, in particular is going, is it's going to be more visible to more people. And that is the difficulty. And one way of figuring that out is turning the support that you see on both sides of the political divide for renewables, start debating it, talking about it, and turning it into something that's actually positive for people living in an area rather than something that's seen as negative.
Okay, Raggy, Scotland's been better at this.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, obviously there's a different policy environment on onshore wind in Scotland. We will be shortly publishing a policy statement that will set out how we're doing some of what Caroline was just talking about for onshore wind, and we will soon be consulting on an energy strategy which will cover solar as well as onshore and every other part of the energy system.
Great stuff. We're basically out of time. There's a load more really interesting questions that I'm very sorry that we didn't have a chance to get to Brendan. Yes, the answer. Anyway, sorry, that's a really abusing chair's privilege. Rather than detain everybody and go beyond 11 o'clock, thank you to all of the authors of our annual review, which is available now. There's also a video and there'll be lots of stuff going on social media. And so please like, retweet, and all of those good things. Thank you to the people behind the scenes, particularly for this event. So that's Jessica and Amber. Thank you again to all of the presenters and panelists. This has been a really good discussion. And another thanks to Keith for chairing our advisory board through all those years. That's it. Time is up, and a very happy Christmas and to all once that arrives. Thanks a lot.